The desert wind carried secrets that night, but none as fragile as the one trembling beneath Sam Carter's calloused hands. Elena's whispered plea, "Go slow, it hurts," cut through him deeper than any Apache arrow ever had. In that abandoned ranch where shadows danced with moonlight, the cowboy who had faced death 100 times discovered his greatest fear, becoming the source of pain for the woman he'd sworn to protect. Her scars told stories his eyes couldn't bear to read, yet his heart refused to look away. Subscribe to discover how love becomes both sanctuary and battlefield in the unforgiving plains of New Mexico. The adobe walls of the abandoned ranch held their breath as Sam Carter's weathered hands trembled against Elena's tear-stained cheek. 3 months had passed since he'd found her half dead in the desert, clutching nothing but a torn rosary and memories that bled like open wounds. The massacre at her village had taken everything: her family, her innocence, her ability to trust the touch of any man. Yet here she was, allowing him closer than anyone had dared since that terrible night when the world turned crimson and her screams echoed across the mesas. The candlelight flickered against her olive skin, revealing scars that mapped a geography of survival, each mark a testament to horrors he could only imagine. Sam had built his reputation on quick draws and quicker decisions, but Elena demanded something he'd never learned in all his years riding the frontier: patience that moved like honey in winter. Her dark eyes searched his face for signs of the violence that lived in most men, the hunger that took without asking, the roughness that broke what it claimed to cherish. He saw himself reflected in those depths, not as the hardened gunslinger who'd earned his name in saloons from Tucson to Santa Fe, but as a man desperate to prove that gentleness could exist in hands that had dealt so much death. The space between them hummed with unspoken promises and the weight of her whispered confession that still rang in his ears like a church bell at dawn. The wind outside rattled the shutters with the persistence of ghosts seeking entry, but inside their sanctuary, time moved differently. Elena's breathing came in shallow waves, each exhale carrying the scent of desert sage and something deeper, the musk of fear slowly transforming into trust. Sam's thumb traced the delicate line of her jaw, feeling the flutter of her pulse beneath skin that had known too much cruelty. He understood now why she flinched at sudden movements, why she slept with a knife beneath her pillow, why she sometimes stared at the horizon as if expecting demons to emerge from the heat shimmer. Her body was a map of survival, and he was learning to read its language with the reverence of a man discovering scripture. The silence between them stretched like the vast expanse of desert that surrounded their refuge, pregnant with possibilities and weighted with the gravity of what they were attempting. Elena's fingers found the buttons of his shirt, her touch so light it might have been imagined, yet each contact sent lightning through his chest. She was offering him something precious and terrifying, not just her body, but her trust, her willingness to believe that not all men were destroyers. Sam felt the responsibility of that gift settle on his shoulders like a mantle made of starlight and thorns. He had faced Apache war parties and Mexican bandits without flinching, but the thought of causing Elena even a moment's pain made his hands shake like a boy's. Her whispered words echoed in the space between heartbeats. "Go slow. It hurts." The admission hung in the air like incense, sacred and devastating. Sam understood that she wasn't just speaking of physical discomfort, but of the deeper wounds that lived in the chambers of her heart. Every man before him had taken what they wanted without regard for the cost, leaving her to gather the scattered pieces of herself in the aftermath. He would be different. He had to be different. The very foundations of who he was demanded it. His response came from a place deeper than conscious thought, a vow that seemed to rise from the earth itself. "I'll die before I hurt you." The promise settled between them like a covenant written in the language of touch and trembling breath. Elena's eyes widened at the fierce certainty in his voice, seeing perhaps for the first time that this man who had killed to protect her was capable of an even greater sacrifice, the death of his own desires if they threatened her healing. The candle flame danced higher, casting their shadows on the wall in an eternal embrace, while outside the desert held its ancient vigil over two souls, learning that love could be both sanctuary and battlefield, that the greatest victories were sometimes won not through conquest, but through the infinite patience of hearts, willing to wait for wounds to transform into doorways. Dawn crept through the cracks in the shutters like a shy animal, painting Elena's sleeping form in shades of gold and amber that made Sam's chest tighten with an emotion he had no name for. She lay curled against his side, her breathing finally deep, and even after hours of restless whispers and gentle reassurances. The night had been a careful excavation of trust, each touch a question asked and answered, in the language of sighs and trembling skin. Sam had discovered that loving Elena required the patience of a man panning for gold, sifting through layers of fear and trauma to find the precious moments when she forgot to be afraid. Her body had slowly relaxed against his, muscle by muscle, breath by breath, until she was no longer the wounded refugee, but simply a woman allowing herself to be cherished. The morning light revealed what darkness had hidden, the full extent of the scars that decorated Elena's back like a constellation of cruelty. Sam's fingers traced them with the reverence of a cartographer mapping sacred territory, each mark telling a story of survival that humbled his own tales of frontier hardship. She stirred at his touch, her eyes opening to meet his with a vulnerability that made his throat close. In the harsh light of day, he expected her to retreat behind the walls she'd built so carefully, to regret the intimacy they'd shared in the forgiving darkness. Instead, she pressed closer, her palm flat against his chest, where his heart hammered out a rhythm of gratitude and fierce protectiveness. The silence of the ranch wrapped around them like a blanket woven from desert wind and morning birdsong. Elena's fingers found the bullet scar on Sam's shoulder, a souvenir from a gunfight in El Paso that had nearly ended his story before it truly began. She traced its edges with the same careful attention he'd shown her wounds, and he realized they were both survivors, both carrying the archaeology of violence on their skin. The difference was that his scars spoke of choices made and battles won, while hers whispered of innocence stolen and trust shattered. Yet here they were, two broken people discovering that their jagged edges might fit together in ways that created something beautiful rather than causing more damage. Elena's voice, when it came, was soft as morning mist rising from the Rio Grande. She spoke of the night her village burned, of hiding in a root cellar while her family's screams echoed above, of the men who found her 3 days later and decided she was worth keeping alive for reasons that still haunted her dreams. Sam listened without judgment, his hands steady on her skin, offering the kind of presence that asked for nothing but gave everything. He understood now why she'd flinched when he'd first tried to help her from her horse, why she'd slept in the barn for weeks before trusting him enough to enter the house. Every kindness he'd shown had been a small victory against the darkness that lived in her memory. The sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of copper and gold that reminded Sam of Elena's skin in candlelight. She told him about her mother's garden, about the songs her grandmother sang while grinding corn, about the boy she'd planned to marry before the world exploded into violence and ash. Her voice carried the weight of a civilization lost, of traditions that would die with her unless she found the courage to rebuild. Sam found himself making silent promises, not just to protect her body, but to guard the precious cargo of her memories, to help her plant new gardens in soil that had known too much blood. He was learning that love wasn't just about desire, but about becoming the keeper of someone else's dreams. As the morning stretched toward noon, Eleanor rose and moved to the window, her silhouette framed against the endless expanse of desert that had become their world. Sam watched her from the bed, memorizing the curve of her spine, the way her hair caught the light like spun obsidian. She was still fragile, still carrying wounds that might never fully heal, but there was something different in her posture now, a straightening of shoulders that spoke of burdens shared rather than carried alone. When she turned back to him, her smile was small but genuine, the first he'd seen that reached her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, and Sam understood that she wasn't just thanking him for the night, but for proving that gentleness could exist in a world that had shown her only cruelty. The day stretched before them like an unwritten page, full of possibilities that neither dared voice aloud. They had crossed a threshold in the darkness, moved from protector and protected to something more complex and precious. Sam rose and dressed slowly, his movements careful and deliberate, showing Elena that he understood the gift she'd given him and would never take it for granted. Outside, the desert waited with its endless patience, but inside their sanctuary, two souls had begun the delicate work of healing each other, one gentle touch at a time, proving that sometimes the greatest courage lay not in facing down enemies, but in learning to trust again. Escriva os capítulos 3-5. Command 4. Narrative chapters 3-5. The morning sun carved long shadows across the ranch as Elena stood at the kitchen window, her fingers tracing the condensation on the glass. Sam had been gone since dawn, checking the fence lines that stretched toward the horizon like scars across the earth. She watched his silhouette move against the vastness, a solitary figure who had become her anchor in a world that had taught her to expect only cruelty. The coffee in her cup had grown cold, but she couldn't bring herself to move away from the window, afraid that if she lost sight of him, he might disappear like everything else she had ever dared to love. The silence of the house pressed against her ears, filled with the ghosts of conversations they hadn't yet learned how to have, words that hung between them like morning mist, beautiful but fragile. Her hand moved unconsciously to her ribs, where the deepest scar lay hidden beneath her dress. Sam had seen it that first night when he'd tended her wounds, his calloused fingers gentle as a whisper as he cleaned away the blood and dirt. She had expected disgust, or worse, the hungry look she'd seen in other men's eyes when they glimpsed her vulnerability. Instead, she'd found something that terrified her more than violence ever could, tenderness so pure it made her want to weep. He had bandaged her wounds as if she were made of spun glass, his jaw tight with an anger that wasn't directed at her but at the world that had dared to mark her skin. In that moment, she had understood that Sam Carter was a man who would carry her pain as if it were his own, and the weight of that realization had settled in her chest like a stone. The sound of hoofbeats pulled her from her reverie, and she watched Sam approach the house with the measured gait of a man who had learned to read danger in every shadow. His horse, a bay gelding named Thunder, moved with the same careful precision as his rider, both of them scarred by battles that had taught them the value of vigilance. Elena smoothed her skirts and moved away from the window, her heart beating faster as she heard his boots on the porch steps. These small moments of reunion had become precious to her, each one a small victory against the fear that whispered he might not return. She busied herself at the stove, reheating the coffee and slicing bread with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from an anticipation she was still learning to trust. Sam entered the kitchen, like a storm cloud seeking shelter, his hat in his hands and dust coating his clothes like a second skin. His eyes found hers immediately, a habit he'd developed since she'd come to stay, as if he needed to confirm her safety before he could allow himself to breathe. The intensity of his gaze made her stomach flutter, a sensation she was still learning to associate with safety rather than danger. He hung his hat on the peg by the door and moved to the basin to wash his hands, the simple domestic ritual somehow intimate in the quiet of the morning. Elena poured fresh coffee into his cup, their fingers brushing as she handed it to him, the contact sending warmth up her arm that had nothing to do with the hot ceramic. "Fence is holding," Sam said, his voice rough from the morning air. "But there's talk in town about rustlers moving through the territory." Eleanor felt her chest tighten at the mention of danger, the old fear rising like bile in her throat. Sam must have seen the change in her expression because he set down his cup and moved closer, his presence solid and reassuring. "They won't come here," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a promise. "I won't let anything happen to you." The words were simple, but Eleanor heard the steel beneath them, the absolute conviction of a man who had never broken his word. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and Sam's hand found hers, his thumb tracing gentle circles across her knuckles until the tension began to leave her shoulders. The rest of the morning passed in comfortable routine, but beneath the surface, Eleanor could feel something shifting between them, like the air before a storm. Sam's glances lingered longer, and when he passed behind her chair to reach for something on the shelf, his hand briefly touched her shoulder, the contact electric and deliberate. She found herself watching the way his hands moved as he worked, remembering their gentleness on her skin, and the memory made her face flush with a heat that had nothing to do with the kitchen fire. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the air between them had grown thick with unspoken desires and the terrible, beautiful knowledge that they were both ready to risk their hearts again, even if it meant facing the possibility of new wounds that might never heal. The afternoon heat shimmered across the desert like a living thing, distorting the horizon until it seemed the earth itself was breathing. Elena sat on the porch steps, mending one of Sam's shirts with careful, precise stitches that spoke of years spent making broken things whole again. The needle moved through the fabric like a prayer, each stitch a small act of devotion that she couldn't quite name. Sam worked in the corral, breaking a young Mustang with the same patient persistence he showed in everything, his voice low and soothing as he gentled the wild creature. Elena found herself mesmerized by the dance between man and horse, the way Sam seemed to understand the animal's fear and respond with unwavering calm. It reminded her of how he had approached her own wildness, never forcing, always waiting for her to come to him on her own terms. The Mustang reared and struck out with its hooves, but Sam held firm, his body moving with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to read the language of frightened things. Elena's needle stilled in her hands as she watched him work, seeing in his movements the same gentle strength he had shown her in their most intimate moments. The horse's eyes rolled white with terror, and Elena felt an echo of recognition in her chest, remembering her own panic the first time Sam had tried to hold her. She had fought him then, her body remembering only violence, but he had simply held her until the storm passed, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos of her fear. The memory made her throat tight with emotion, and she pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heart beat against her palm like a caged bird, learning to trust the hand that fed it. A cloud passed over the sun, casting the corral in shadow, and in that moment of dimmed light, Elena saw Sam's face clearly for the first time that day. There was exhaustion there, lines of weariness that spoke of sleepless nights and the weight of promises he carried like stones in his chest. She realized with a start that he had been protecting her not just from external threats, but from his own needs, holding himself back with the same iron discipline he used to gentle wild horses. The understanding hit her like a physical blow, and she set aside her mending, her hands shaking with the sudden need to go to him, to offer him the same comfort he had given her so freely. She rose from the steps and walked toward the corral, her bare feet silent on the sun-baked earth. Sam looked up as she approached, his eyes questioning, and she saw the moment he registered something different in her expression. The Mustang snorted and shied away, sensing the change in the air. But Sam's attention was entirely focused on Eleanor now, his body still as he waited to see what she would do. She reached the fence and climbed onto the bottom rail, bringing herself closer to his eye level, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes and the way his breathing had changed. The space between them felt charged with possibility, like the air before lightning strikes, and Elena found herself leaning forward, drawn by a gravity she was finally ready to surrender to. "Sam," she said, his name a whisper that carried the weight of everything she couldn't yet say. He moved toward her slowly, his hands gentle as he helped her down from the fence, and when her feet touched the ground, she didn't step away. Instead, she reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw with a reverence that made his breath catch. His skin was warm and rough beneath her palm, marked by sun and wind and the passage of hard years. But to her, it felt like coming home. Sam's eyes closed at her touch, and she saw the way his whole body seemed to exhale, as if he'd been holding his breath for weeks and could finally allow himself to breathe again. The Mustang whinnied softly from across the corral, a sound that seemed to bless their moment of connection, and Elena felt something inside her chest unfurl like a flower opening to the sun. She had spent so long afraid of her own desires, convinced that wanting something meant it would be taken away, but standing here with Sam's face in her hands, she finally understood that some risks were worth taking. The afternoon stretched before them like an unwritten page, full of possibilities that no longer seemed too dangerous to explore, and for the first time since the massacre, Elena allowed herself to believe that she might be brave enough to love again, even if it meant learning to trust not just Sam, but herself. Evening painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. The desert transformed into something ethereal and forgiving, as the harsh light of day gave way to the gentle embrace of dusk. Elena stood at the bedroom window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass, watching Sam tend to the horses in the corral below. The day's heat still radiated from the earth, but there was a coolness in the air that spoke of night's approach, and with it, the promise of intimacy that had been building between them like a slow-burning fire. Her hands trembled as she unpinned her hair, letting it fall in dark waves around her shoulders, each movement deliberate and weighted with intention. She had made her choice in the corral that afternoon, and now the evening stretched before them, like an invitation she was finally ready to accept. The sound of Sam's boots on the stairs made her heart race, each footstep a drumbeat that echoed the rhythm of her pulse. She turned from the window as he appeared in the doorway, his silhouette backlit by the lamp in the hallway, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the space that had become their sanctuary. His eyes held a question she had seen there for weeks, patient and hopeful, and tinged with the fear of a man who had learned that the things he loved could be taken away without warning. Elena answered him without words, her hand extended in invitation, and she watched the way relief and desire warred across his features as he stepped into the room and closed the door behind him with infinite care. Sam approached her slowly, as if she were a wild creature that might bolt at any sudden movement, and Elena felt a rush of tenderness for this man who had learned to gentle his own strength for her sake. His hands found her face with the same reverence she had shown him in the corral, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones, as if he were memorizing her features in the dying light. When he kissed her, it was with a softness that made her knees weak, a careful exploration that spoke of weeks of restraint finally given permission to unfurl. She tasted the salt of his skin and the sweetness of his breath, and beneath it all, the metallic tang of fear that they both carried like a shared secret. "Elena," he whispered against her lips, her name a prayer and a question and a promise all at once. She answered by pressing closer, her hands finding the buttons of his shirt with fingers that shook not from fear, but from the overwhelming need to feel his skin against hers. Each button was a small surrender, each inch of exposed flesh a victory against the voices that told her she was too broken to be loved. Sam's hands stilled hers when she fumbled with the last button, his eyes searching her face for any sign of doubt, and she saw in his expression the same careful attention he had shown when tending her wounds that first night. The parallel made her throat tight with emotion, and she realized that this too was a kind of healing, a different sort of wound being gently tended. The lamp flickered and cast dancing shadows on the walls as they moved together with the careful choreography of two people learning to trust not just each other, but themselves. Sam's touch was reverent, his hands mapping the geography of her scars, with a tenderness that transformed them from marks of shame into evidence of survival. When she tensed at a particularly tender spot, he stilled immediately, his lips finding the hollow of her throat as he whispered words of comfort and reassurance. Elena felt tears slip down her cheeks, not from pain, but from the overwhelming realization that she was safe, that this man would indeed die before he hurt her, and that for the first time in her life she was with someone who saw her brokenness not as something to be fixed, but as something to be honored. The night deepened around them as they discovered the language of gentle passion, each touch a word in a conversation they had been learning to have since the day she arrived. Sam's whispered endearments mixed with her soft gasps of pleasure, creating a symphony that drowned out the ghosts of violence that had haunted her dreams for so long. When she finally surrendered completely, it was with the knowledge that she was not just giving herself to him, but reclaiming herself from the darkness that had tried to steal her capacity for joy. In the aftermath, as they lay entwined in the lamplight, Elena pressed her ear to Sam's chest and listened to the steady rhythm of his heart, understanding finally that love was not about the absence of scars, but about finding someone brave enough to trace them with gentle fingers and call them beautiful.